The dream had a name, and its name was the Grand Concert Hall. To her, it wasn't just a building. It was a cathedral built of sound and ambition. From the moment she had first heard an orchestra play within its gilded walls as a little girl, she had known this was where she belonged. Not just in the audience, but on the stage, with the warm lights on her face and the weight of a beautiful, silent instrument in her hands. The Young Artist Showcase was the gatekeeper to that dream. The one chance a year for someone like her. Someone from a quiet neighborhood and a family that knew more about fixing leaky faucets than fugues. To step into that world, her chosen weapon was a cello, an old, dark wood instrument that seemed to hold as many stories as she did. It had a small scratch just below the strings, a mark she'd made herself by accident in her first year of playing, and she'd sometimes rub her thumb over it like a lucky charm. For this showcase, she had chosen a piece of music that was notorious for its difficulty, a modern composition called Shattered Glass. The name felt right. It was a piece that required not just technical perfection, but a raw, bleeding emotion. It could sound like a beautiful window pane catching the morning light, or it could sound like that same pane exploding into 1,000 tiny, sharp pieces. She wanted to play it perfectly, to show the world she could control the chaos. Her days had dissolved into a blur of practice. Her fingers, already dotted with the permanent calluses of a musician, became sore and then numb, only to wake up the next morning aching to play again. The world outside her small apartment room seemed to fade away. Friends would text, asking if she wanted to go out for a movie, and she would look at the blinking light on her phone, then back at the sheet music spread across her stand, and promise herself she would see them after. After the showcase, the music became her only language. She would hum the melodies while she cooked, tap out the rhythms on the table, and dream of the arpeggios in her sleep. The pressure didn't just come from within. It was embodied in her mentor, a man who had once been a celebrated cellist himself. He was a towering figure with a stern face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He smelled of old sheet music and a sharp, clean cologne, and his presence in a room was enough to make her back straighten. He was the one who had told her she had the potential for greatness, but he was also the one who made her feel like she was always just one mistake away from proving him wrong. During their last practice session before the showcase, he had stopped her mid-phrase. "No," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "You are playing the notes. You are not playing the music. Shattered Glass is not about being pretty. It is about breaking. Let me feel the break." He had made her play the same difficult passage over 20 times, until her hands were shaking and tears of frustration pricked her eyes. When she finally played it to his satisfaction, he had simply nodded once, a curt, sharp movement. "Don't disappoint me," he said before turning to leave. The words hung in the air long after he was gone. The night of the showcase arrived with a crisp autumn chill. The city lights blurred past the car window as her parents drove her to the hall. Her mother kept patting her hand, her own palm slightly damp with nervous sweat. "We're so proud of you, no matter what happens," she said, for what must have been the 10th time that evening. Her father was quiet, but he met her eyes in the rearview mirror and gave her a small, confident smile. It was meant to be reassuring, but it only added another layer of weight to the already immense pressure on her shoulders. She couldn't just fail. She would be failing them too. Backstage was a chaotic mix of terror and ego. A young man with a violin was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. A girl with a flute was laughing loudly with her friends, seemingly without a care in the world. The air was thick with the smell of rosin and expensive perfume. She found a small corner and sat with her cello, her heart thumping a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She closed her eyes and tried to visualize the performance, to see herself playing flawlessly, the audience rising to their feet. But all she could see was her mentor's stern face and hear his voice telling her not to disappoint him. Then, a voice over the speaker system called her name. It was time. The walk from the wings to the center of the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. The floorboards seemed to sway beneath her feet. As she stepped into the light, the world shrank to just her cello, and a vast, dark sea of faces. She could see the silhouette of critics in the front row, their pens poised over notepads. She saw her parents beaming a few rows back. And she saw him, her mentor, sitting right in the center, his expression unreadable in the dim light. She settled the cello against her shoulder, the familiar wood a small comfort. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and anticipation. She placed her bow on the strings and began. For the first few moments, it was magical. The music flowed from her as if it had been waiting inside her for a lifetime. The difficult opening melody, a series of soaring, high notes, came out clear and pure. She felt a connection to the instrument, to the hall, to the silent, listening crowd. She saw a woman in the third row close her eyes, a small smile on her face. A wave of confidence washed over her. She could do this. She was doing this. She moved into the more complex part of the piece, the section that represented the first cracks in the glass. The tempo quickened, the notes becoming more aggressive and staccato. It was here that she felt the first drop of sweat trickle down her temple. Her hands, which had felt so steady just moments before, began to feel slick. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the music, but a tiny seed of panic had been planted. She thought of her mentor's words, "Let me feel the break." What if she broke in the wrong way? The panic began to bloom in her chest, a cold, heavy flower. Her fingers, once dancing on the strings, now felt clumsy and foreign. She hit a note slightly off-key, a small, jarring sound that was barely noticeable to most but screamed at her like a siren. She flinched, and in that tiny moment of lost concentration, her grip on the bow faltered. She pressed down too hard, putting all her anxiety and fear into the stroke. And then, it happened, a sound like a gunshot ripped through the silent hall. Twang! The string on her cello snapped, whipping back with a violent force. The vibrations shuddered through the entire instrument, and the beautiful melody she had been crafting died a sudden, ugly death. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. She froze, her bow still hovering in the air, her mind completely blank. All she could do was stare at the broken, dangling string. A silver thread of her failure. From the front row, she saw a movement. It was her mentor. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look concerned. He slowly, deliberately shook his head. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a physical blow. Then came the sigh. An audible exhalation of disgust and disappointment that seemed to be amplified by the hall's perfect acoustics. And finally, the ultimate public condemnation. He stood up, turned his back on the stage, and walked out of the auditorium, his figure disappearing into the darkness of the side aisle. A few people in the audience started to whisper. Someone let out a short, sharp laugh. The whispers grew into a low murmur that felt like 1,000 bees buzzing in her ears. The heat of 1,000 spotlights seemed to concentrate on her face, and she knew it must be beet red. The world tilted. The faces in the crowd blurred into a single, judgmental entity. She wasn't a musician anymore. She was a spectacle. A failure. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The only thought that cut through the fog of her humiliation was a primal, desperate need to escape. To get away from all those eyes, from the echoes of the snapped string, from the ghost of her mentor's retreating back. Without another look, she turned and fled, running blindly off the stage, leaving her cello abandoned on its stand like a fallen soldier on a battlefield. The heavy velvet curtains swallowed her whole, but she knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her gut, that she was not the only one who would remember this night. The whole world would remember her shame. The heavy velvet curtains felt like they were swallowing her whole, but the silence they offered was a lie. Behind her, she could still feel the weight of 1,000 stares, could still hear the ghost of that one, sharp laugh. She didn't stop running until she was in the cold, concrete hallway backstage, her breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. A stagehand with a headset gave her a curious, pitying look before turning away. She found her parents near the exit, her mother's face a mask of confusion and worry, her father's smile long gone, replaced by a deep frown. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't have to. They just wrapped her in a clumsy, 3-person hug that felt more like a cage than a comfort. The car ride home was the worst part of the night. The silence in the car was thick and suffocating, broken only by her mother's occasional, soft sniffles. Her father drove with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead at the road. The cello case lay in the trunk, and she felt its presence like a dead body they were all trying to pretend wasn't there. Back in her small apartment. The sanctuary that had once been filled with music now felt like a tomb. Her father carried the cello in and set it down gently in the corner of the living room, as if afraid it might explode. No one spoke. Her mother made her a cup of tea that she didn't touch. After a few agonizing minutes, her parents left, promising to call in the morning. Their departure was a relief. She didn't want their pity. She didn't want their gentle words. She just wanted to be alone with her shame. She sat on the couch for hours, staring at the cello in the corner. It was no longer her beautiful, dark wood instrument full of stories. It was a monster, a monument to her public humiliation. The scratch below the strings, her lucky charm, now looked like a scar, a permanent mark of her failure. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it all again, the slickness of her sweaty hands, the flinch of her fingers, the violent twang of the snapping string, and most clearly, the look of disgust on her mentor's face as he turned his back on her. That image was burned onto the back of her eyelids. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the building, every distant siren, sounded like that snapped string echoing in the vast, silent concert hall. The next day she dared to go online. It was a mistake. The internet was a carnivorous animal, and her failure was the fresh meat they had all been waiting for. Someone had uploaded a video from the audience. It was titled, "Worst Meltdown Ever?" The thumbnail was a blurry still of her face, frozen in a mask of horror. She clicked on it, a morbid curiosity she couldn't control. There it was, in high-definition sound. The beautiful beginning, the slight fumble, the jarring off-key note, and then the gunshot snap of the string. The video creator had added a silly, BOing sound effect and a zoom-in on her mentor walking out. The comments were a cesspool of cruelty. "Cringe overload," one read. "Guess she couldn't handle the pressure, LOL," said another. A self-proclaimed music expert had written a long paragraph dissecting her obvious psychological fragility and fundamental lack of stage presence. They had taken her deepest wound and turned it into public entertainment. A 5-minute clip to be consumed and forgotten by everyone but her. A few days later, a local arts blog published a short article about the showcase. It mentioned her by name. Buried at the end of the piece was a quote from her mentor. It was short, professional, and utterly devastating. "It is always disappointing when a student, despite their talent, is unable to translate their hard work into a professional performance," the statement read. "The stage demands not just skill, but resilience. That is a lesson some must learn the hard way." He hadn't even used her name. She was just a student, a cautionary tale. His words were a public execution, a final, authoritative stamp on her failure. In the tight-knit world of classical musicians, where his word was law, this was a professional death sentence. No other teacher would take her on now. No orchestra would even consider her. The shame was a physical weight. It pressed down on her shoulders as she walked to the grocery store, making her feel like everyone was staring, like they all recognized her as the girl who broke on stage. She started wearing hoodies, keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact. The world, which had once seemed so full of potential, now felt like a hostile place. She stopped answering her phone. Her friends' text messages piled up, their little bubbles on her screen, a constant reminder of the life she was no longer living. "You okay? Heard what happened. That sucks. Let's get ice cream, my treat." She couldn't face them. She couldn't face their sympathy or their questions. How could she explain that she didn't just lose a competition? She had lost herself? After a year passed. The seasons changed, but the world inside her apartment remained a permanent, muted gray. The dream of the concert hall had shriveled into a painful memory she kept locked away, and the cello in the corner of the room had become a piece of furniture, a dark silhouette she trained herself not to see. She had found a new life, or rather, a new way of not living. It was in a small office on the 7th floor of a building that smelled of stale coffee and cleaning chemicals. Her job was data entry. It was perfect. It required no passion, no creativity, no soul. All it required was for her fingers to move from keyboard to mouse in a repetitive, mindless rhythm for 8 hours a day. The constant, low hum of the computers and the soft clicking of keys became her new soundtrack, a monotone drone that successfully drowned out the echo of a snapping string. She had become an expert at being invisible. She wore neutral-colored clothes, kept her head down, and ate her lunch at her desk, responding to any attempt at conversation with a polite but firm smile that signaled a clear boundary. Her colleagues, a mix of kind and indifferent people, eventually stopped trying. She was just the quiet girl in the corner, the one who got her work done on time, but never joined them for happy hour. She told herself she liked the quiet. She told herself she was safe. But late at night, when the only sound was the traffic far below her window, the silence would roar back to life and she would curl into a ball. The shame a physical weight on her chest. The change began, as it often does, with something mundane. It was a Tuesday, and the rain had been falling all day, a steady, miserable drizzle that made the city outside her window look like a water painting left out in the storm. The apartment felt smaller than usual, the air thick and stale. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she had properly cleaned out her closet. It had become a graveyard for her old life, a place where she had shoved everything that reminded her of music. Armed with a sudden restless energy, she decided to tackle it. She pulled out old clothes, shoes she hadn't worn in years, and boxes filled with random junk. It was while she was on her hands and knees, reaching for a lost shoe, that her fingers brushed against the rough edge of a cardboard box tucked away in the very back, behind a stack of old college textbooks. She pulled it out. It was heavy. On the top, written in her own younger, more hopeful handwriting, were the words, "My music." Her first instinct was to shove it back into the darkness, to pretend she had never found it. But something, a flicker of curiosity she hadn't felt in months, made her pause. She carried the box to the living room and sat on the floor, the rain drumming a soft rhythm against the window pane. With a deep breath, she lifted the flaps. The first thing she saw were the neat, professionally printed booklets of music she had studied for the showcase. The clean, black notes on the white pages looked like a flock of sharp, orderly birds. She saw the title on the top one, Shattered Glass. Her stomach clenched, and she quickly set that stack aside. Underneath them, however, was a mess of loose papers held together by rubber bands that had mostly disintegrated over time. These were her own compositions. The paper was yellowed at the edges, and the notes were written in pencil, some smudged by her teenage fingers, others crossed out in frustration. There were little doodles in the margins, stars, hearts, silly faces. This wasn't the music of perfection. This was the music of discovery. It was the sound of a girl who played for no other reason than because she had a melody inside her that needed to get out. She hesitantly pulled one of the sheets out. It was a simple melody, short and sweet, with clumsy chord progressions that a professional would have scoffed at. She remembered writing it. She was 15, sitting by the window on a summer afternoon watching the kids play outside. It wasn't about anything important. It was just about the feeling of the sun on her face and the taste of the ice cream she was eating. It was pure and uncomplicated. She looked across the room at the piano, which had also been silent for a year, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. The cello was a symbol of her failure, a public instrument of her shame. But the piano felt different. It had always been her private diary, the place where she tinkered with her own ideas. Standing up slowly, as if in a trance, she walked over to it. She wiped the dust from the keys with her sleeve, her hand trembling slightly. She sat down on the worn bench, the cool wood feeling strange beneath her. She placed the old, yellowed sheet music on the stand. For a long time, she just sat there, her fingers hovering over the ivory keys. What was she doing? This was a bad idea. This would only bring back the pain. But the rain continued to fall, and the memory of that simple, happy melody felt like a tiny, warm light in the vast, cold darkness of her memory. She took a breath and pressed down on a key. A single, clear C note filled the quiet apartment. The sound was so unexpected, so loud in the silence, that it made her jump. It was the first note she had played in a year. It felt like a betrayal and a relief all at once. She looked at the music, at the familiar pencil marks, and let her fingers find the next note. Then the next. Her playing was clumsy and halting at first, her fingers stiff and out of practice. But as the simple melody unfolded, a muscle memory deeper than her trauma began to take over. The music wasn't brilliant. It was simple, a little naive, and technically imperfect. But it was honest. And as she played, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't happiness. It wasn't even sadness. It was a feeling of recognition. She was remembering a part of herself she had buried, a part that wasn't defined by failure or by a stern mentor's approval. She was just a girl who liked to make up songs. She played until her fingers were tired and the rain had stopped. That night, for the first time in a year, she didn't dream of the snapping string. The next evening, after another gray day at the office, she found herself back at the piano. But this time, she didn't play the old music. She took out a fresh, clean sheet of paper and a pencil. She thought about the past year. She thought about the silence, the heavy weight of shame, the moments of feeling completely broken. She didn't try to write something beautiful or complex. She just let her fingers wander on the keys, trying to find the notes that matched the feeling. The music that emerged was sparse and haunting. It was filled with long pauses, moments of complete silence that were just as important as the notes themselves. There were dissonant chords that felt like the sharp pain of a bad memory, and soft, simple melodies that felt like a quiet sigh. She wasn't writing for an audience or a maestro. She was writing for herself. It was a conversation with her own pain. She worked on it late into the night after night, a secret ritual in the dark of her apartment. It wasn't a masterpiece for the world, but it was a lifeline for her. She didn't have a name for it, but in her head, she started to call it the unfinished adagio, because she was unfinished. And this slow, sad music was the sound of her starting to find her way back, one quiet, imperfect note at a time. The music she wrote in the dark of her apartment was a secret language, a conversation between her and the silence. But a secret language by its nature is lonely. As the weeks went by, the notes of the unfinished adagio began to feel trapped within the four walls of her room. They needed to breathe. She didn't think of it as a performance or a comeback. It was a much simpler, more desperate need. She needed to know if the music was real, or if it was just a phantom she had created to keep herself company. Could a feeling, a broken and healing feeling, actually travel through the air and be understood by someone else? The idea of playing in public again was terrifying. The grand concert hall loomed in her memory like a haunted house. But she knew she couldn't go back there. She needed the opposite of that place. She needed somewhere small, somewhere imperfect, somewhere no one expected perfection. One evening, scrolling through a local events page on her computer, she saw an ad for a weekly open mic night at a small downtown jazz bar. The picture showed a dimly lit corner with a single microphone stand and a worn-out stool. It wasn't a stage. It was just a space. The people in the photo were laughing, drinks in hand, not sitting in hushed reverence. This felt right. This felt safe enough. The decision was made, but the journey to the bar was a battle. For days, she argued with herself. The voice of her shame was loud and clear. "You'll embarrass yourself again," it hissed. "They'll laugh. You know they'll laugh." But a newer, quieter voice whispered back, "What if they don't? What if just one person listens?" The night of the open mic, she felt physically sick. She took her cello out of its case for the first time in a year. The broken string was still there, a limp, silver reminder. She ordered a new one online and watched a tutorial on how to replace it, her clumsy fingers fumbling with the fine tuners and the peg at the top. When she finally tightened the new string and plucked it, the clear, strong a note that filled the room felt like a small victory. It was a tiny act of repair, a way of telling herself that broken things could be fixed, She put the cello in its case and walked out, into the cool night air. The bar was only a few blocks away, but the walk felt like a mile. Every siren made her jump. Every group of laughing people on the sidewalk felt like a potential jury. When she finally pushed open the heavy door to the bar, a wave of sound and smell washed over her. It was the complete opposite of the concert hall. The air was thick with the smell of old wood, spilled beer, and fryer grease. The low hum of dozens of conversations, the clinking of glasses, and the quiet bass line of a song playing on the speakers created a comforting wall of noise. No one noticed her come in. No one cared. She was just another person in a crowd. She found a small table in the back, hidden in the shadows, and kept her cello case by her feet out of sight. She watched as a man with an acoustic guitar played a funny song about his cat, followed by a woman who recited a passionate poem about the moon. The applause was polite and scattered. People were here to have a drink and chat. The performers were just background noise. This was exactly what she had hoped for. When the host, a friendly guy with a beard and a flannel shirt, called for the next sign-up, her heart started pounding. She felt a surge of adrenaline, the fight or flight instinct screaming at her to run. But she thought of the new string on her cello. She thought of the quiet voice that had asked, "What if just one person listens?" She stood up on shaky legs and walked to the sign-up sheet. She wrote down just her first name and cello in messy handwriting. She waited for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the host said, "Okay, next up we have a cellist. Let's give a warm welcome." A few people clapped politely. Her legs felt like lead as she walked from the safety of her table to the small, cleared corner of the room. There was no grand entrance, no spotlight. Just a single floor lamp that cast a warm yellow glow. She didn't adjust the microphone. She didn't introduce herself or the piece. She just sat on the worn stool, settled the cello against her body, and closed her eyes. She took one deep breath and let it all go, the memory of the concert hall, the fear of judgment, the weight of the past year. There was only her, the cello, and the feeling she needed to share. She began to play. The first notes were quiet, almost hesitant. They were long, mournful notes that hung in the air like a question. The music wasn't beautiful in a traditional way. It was filled with the pauses she had come to know so well, moments of complete silence that were as heavy and meaningful as the notes themselves. It was the sound of loneliness, of picking up the pieces. A few people in the bar continued their conversations, but slowly, one by one, they started to stop. A man telling a loud story to his friend trailed off mid-sentence. A couple who had been scrolling through their phones put them down, face down on the table. The bartender, who had been wiping a glass with a rag, stopped and just listened. Leaning on the bar, the melody was simple, but it was drenched in emotion. It was the sound of her crying on her apartment floor. It was the sound of her finding that old box of music. It was the sound of her playing that first simple note on the piano. As she played, she poured all of it into the instrument, the shame, the fear, the tiny flicker of hope. The music swelled slightly, not into a crescendo of triumph, but into a deeper, more profound sadness. It was the sound of accepting the break, of understanding that some things can't be fixed perfectly, but can be made whole again in a different way. She saw a woman in the front row, who had been laughing with her friends just minutes before, bring a hand up to her cheek, wiping away a tear. Then she saw a man at the bar do the same. The room was now completely silent, except for the sound of her cello. The wall of noise had disappeared, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding. She wasn't a background noise anymore. She was the only thing in the world that mattered to them in that moment. She played the final, fading note, a soft, whispering sound that seemed to hold all the sorrow and all the peace she had found. She let the note hang in the air until it was completely gone, leaving a profound silence in its wake. No one moved. No one spoke for what felt like a full 10 seconds. It was a sacred, respectful silence, the kind of silence you give to something truly important. Then someone in the back started to clap. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was a soft, slow applause that quickly spread through the room until everyone was clapping. It was the sound of appreciation, of connection, of being seen. She opened her eyes and looked out at the small crowd. Many of them had tears in their eyes. They weren't looking at her with pity or judgment. They were looking at her with a look of deep, personal recognition. She gave a small, shaky nod, not as a performer taking a bow, but as one human being acknowledging another. She quickly packed up her cello and walked back to her table, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a quiet, overwhelming shock. She had shared her deepest wound, and instead of being ridiculed, she had been understood. The walk home from the bar was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one she had known for the past year. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of her apartment, but a soft, peaceful quiet that seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. The city lights didn't look like a blurry, judgmental audience anymore. They just looked like lights. She carried her cello, its weight a familiar comfort rather than a burden. Back in her apartment, she didn't hide it in the corner. She leaned it against the wall in her living room, where she could see it. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind you feel after a long, hard day of meaningful work. She had shared a piece of her soul, and for the first time in a long time, it hadn't been thrown back in her face. It had been held gently. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The first real rest she had had in over a year. A few days later, she got an email from a friend she hadn't spoken to since before the showcase. The subject line was just... She opened it, hesitant, expecting another awkward attempt at consolation. But the body of the email just contained a link. "Is this you?" her friend had written. She clicked the link, her heart starting to beat a little faster. It was a video on a popular video-sharing site. The thumbnail was a grainy shot of the corner of the jazz bar. She recognized her own silhouette, hunched over the cello. The title of the video was simple. This was at an open mic tonight. "I've never heard anything like it." She took a deep breath and pressed play. The sound was tinny, recorded on a phone, but it was her. It was then finished adagio. Watching it, she felt a strange detachment. She saw herself, this unknown woman in a dark bar, pouring her heart out. She saw the small crowd, the way they had slowly turned to listen, the way the room had fallen silent. The video ended just after she finished playing, before the applause started. It was just the music and the silence. She scrolled down to the comments, bracing herself for the worst. But the comments were not what she expected. There were no cruel jokes, no critiques of her technique. Instead, they were like a collection of quiet confessions. "I don't know who this is, but I just went through a really bad breakup, and this is exactly how I feel," one read. "This is what healing sounds like." "It's not pretty, but it's real," said another. A person commented, "I showed this to my therapist. She said it's a perfect example of expressing grief through art." The video wasn't going viral in the way of funny cat videos or celebrity scandals. It was spreading slowly, deeply, passed from person to person like a secret handshake. It found its way to online support groups for anxiety, to forums for grieving people, to playlists titled "Songs for When You're Feeling Alone." Her private pain had accidentally become a public comfort. She didn't feel famous. She felt seen. The video eventually made its way to the desk of the director of the Young Artist Showcase. The director was an older woman with silver hair and a reputation for having an unerring ear for true talent. She was in her office, going through a mountain of audition tapes for the next year's competition, when her assistant, a young woman who had been at the open mic that night, popped her head in. "You have to see this," the assistant said, her voice full of excitement. She played the phone video. The director watched, her expression unreadable. When it was over, she was silent for a long moment. "Who is that?" she asked. Her assistant didn't know, just that her first name had been on the sign-up sheet. It took them a few days of searching, but they found her. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while she was at her desk, mindlessly entering data into a spreadsheet. A calm professional voice on the other end of the line introduced herself as the director of the showcase. Her heart sank, expecting some kind of reprimand or a request to take the video down, but the director's tone was warm and respectful. "We saw the video from the open mic," she said. "What you did? That wasn't just a performance. It was a gift. We would be honored if you would consider performing at our gala next year. Not as a contestant, she added quickly, as if sensing her hesitation. As a featured guest. There's no competition. No judges. Just you and your music on our stage. The offer sent her into a tailspin. The grand concert hall, the place of her greatest humiliation. The thought of walking back onto that stage made her feel physically ill. Every instinct screamed at her to say no. Why would she willingly walk back into the lion's den? But then she thought of the comments on the video. She thought of the faces in the jazz bar, the tears in their eyes, the shared silence. This wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about proving her mentor wrong or redeeming herself. It was about finishing the conversation she had started that night. It was about taking her private healing and offering it to the world in the place where she had been broken. After a week of sleepless nights and long talks with her cello, she called the director back and said yes. The night of the gala felt like a strange dream. It was the anniversary of her fall. The marquee outside the concert hall was the same. The grand foyer was filled with the same scent of expensive perfume and anticipation. But this time, her name was on the program, not as a contestant, but under a special heading, a special performance. Backstage, she wasn't a bundle of nerves. She was calm, centered. She had a different purpose now. She wasn't there to win anything. She was there to share something. As she waited in the wings, she peeked through the curtains. The hall was just as full as it had been that night, the same sea of faces, the same glittering chandeliers. And then she saw him. Her former mentor was sitting in the third row, his white hair gleaming under the lights. He wasn't on his phone or talking to anyone. He was just sitting there, waiting, his face a neutral mask, when her name was called. The walk to the center of the stage was different. It wasn't a walk of terror. It was a walk of purpose. The lights felt warm, not harsh. The silence from the audience was not one of judgment, but of anticipation. They knew her story. They were there to listen. She sat on the same stool, settled the same cello against her body, and looked out at the crowd. She didn't see critics or competitors. She just saw people. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to play the unfinished adagio. In the vast, perfect acoustics of the grand concert hall, the music was transformed. It was no longer a quiet, personal whisper. It was a profound, resonant voice that filled every corner of the room. The long pauses were no longer just moments of silence. They were vast, shared spaces of reflection. The dissonant chords that spoke of pain now echoed with the collective memory of everyone in the room who had ever been broken. The simple, sorrowful melody was no longer just her story. It became their story. She played with a depth of emotion she had never touched before. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was channeling every moment of the past year, the shame, the loneliness, the quiet discovery, the tentative hope. She poured it all into the music, and the hall drank it in. As she played, she let her eyes open and scanned the crowd. She saw people with their eyes closed, lost in the music. She saw people holding hands. She saw tears streaming down the faces of strangers. And then her eyes found the third row. Her former mentor was sitting perfectly still, his head bowed. As the final, fading note of the adagio hung in the air, shimmering with unspoken emotion, she saw him bring a hand up to his face. He wasn't just wiping a tear. His shoulders were shaking. The man who had taught her that music was about perfection, that emotion was a weakness to be controlled, was sitting in the audience, openly weeping. In that moment, she felt no sense of victory, only a profound sense of peace. Her music had reached him, too. It had broken through the walls he had built around himself, just as it had broken through the walls of her own shame. When the last echo of the note disappeared, the hall was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then, a single person in the back stood up and began to clap. It was followed by another, and another, until the entire audience was on their feet, their applause not loud and boisterous, but deep and thunderous. A roar of emotional release and gratitude. She stood up, her heart full, and took a bow. She had not just redeemed herself. She had taken her deepest wound and transformed it into a masterpiece that had healed not just her own soul, but the souls of everyone who listened. She was no longer the girl who had broken on stage. She was the artist who had learned how to play the cracks.